Montana Territory, November 1879. The most respected builder in Bitterroot Valley stood in front of foundation that made no sense. Circular, 12 feet across. Nothing but river stone and clay mortar rising from frozen ground. "That'll collapse before spring," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. The man laying the stones didn't look up. His name was Emmett Carver, a Pennsylvania stonemason who'd come west with nothing but his tools and a memory that wouldn't let him rest. He'd watch his family freeze in a square cabin that ate firewood faster than he could split it. He'd sworn he'd never build that way again. The crowd laughed. A round cabin? In Montana? Where winter could drop to 20 below and stay there for weeks. They called it dangerous. Wasteful. A fool's experiment with his family's lives. But by February, when the worst cold in a decade settled over the valley, those same people would be standing outside that round stone wall, hands pressed against it, feeling heat radiate through 2 feet of thermal mass while their own cabins sat dark and frozen. Today, you're going to understand exactly what Emmett Carver knew that the experts missed. And if you want to learn one frontier technique every week that actually worked when survival depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. Then drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this knowledge crosses borders. Let's go back to 1879, when one man's dangerous idea became the warmest cabin in Montana. Bitterroot Valley had a way of building cabins, and it hadn't changed in 20 years. Rectangular, log walls chinked with moss and clay, stone fireplace on one end, wooden floor raised 6 inches off the ground to keep the rot at bay. It was the pattern every settler followed, the design every experienced builder recommended, the structure that had sheltered families since the first wagons rolled through. It was also freezing them half to death. Emmett Carver had spent his first Montana winter in one of those cabins, and he'd spent every night of it feeding a fire that couldn't keep up. The corner stayed cold no matter how much wood he burned. Wind found every gap between the logs. The stone fireplace radiated heat straight up the chimney, while the floor stayed ice-cold beneath his children's feet. By morning, the water bucket had a skin of ice, and the fire had died to ash. He'd burned through 4 cords of wood that winter. His neighbors burned through 5, and every single one of them told him the same thing. That's just how winter is in Montana. You split more wood. You bank the fire at night. You accept the cold. Emmett couldn't accept it. He'd been a stonemason in Pennsylvania, building foundations for mills and houses that would stand for 100 years. He understood thermal mass. He understood how stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. He'd seen it work in the old country, in structures that stayed warm with half the fuel. But more than that, he remembered geometry. A square cabin has 4 corners. For dead zones where heat doesn't reach, where cold air settles and stays. For right angles that create turbulence, that break the natural circulation of warm air. Every corner is a weak point, a place where logs meet imperfectly, where gaps open as the wood dries and shrinks. A circle has none of that. In a round structure, heat moves in a continuous flow. There are no corners to trap cold air, no sharp angles to disrupt convection. The wall curves back on itself, creating a unified thermal envelope that holds warmth the way a cupped hand holds water. And if you build that wall from stone, dense, heavy stone with enough mass to store the day's heat and release it through the long night, you don't just have a cabin. You have a battery. Emmett started gathering river stone in August, while the weather was still warm enough to work the mortar. He chose pieces the size of a man's head, dense sandstone and granite that would pack tight and hold heat. He sorted them by shape, planning the curve of each course before he ever broke ground. By September, he'd laid his foundation, a perfect circle 12 feet in diameter, sunk 2 feet into the earth to anchor against frost heave. The interior would give him 113 square feet of living space, tight, but enough for a family of 4 if you built smart. The walls would rise 7 feet high and taper from 24 inches thick at the base to 18 inches at the roofline. Not because he couldn't build them thinner, but because he needed that mass. Every inch of stone was a reservoir for heat, a buffer against the night. He placed the door on the south side, facing away from the prevailing north wind. The chimney he set dead center, rising straight through a conical roof that would shed snow and rain without creating the flat valleys where ice could build up and leak through. The design was unconventional. It broke every rule the valley's builders followed. But Emmett Carver wasn't trying to follow rules. He was trying to keep his family warm. And he was about to find out just how much the experts hated anyone who questioned the way things had always been done. The foundation went up in 3 weeks, and that's when the criticism started in earnest. Martin Hodge was the valley's senior builder, a man who'd put up 24 cabins and never had one fail. He came by on a cold October morning, watched Emmett set stones in a sweeping curve, and shook his head like he was witnessing a man dig his own grave. "You're building around," Hodge said. It wasn't a question. "I am. That wall's 2 feet thick at the bottom. 24 inches, yes." Hodge walked the perimeter, his boots crunching frost. "You know how much stone that is? How much mortar? How much time you're wasting when you could frame a proper cabin in a week?" Emmett tapped a stone into place, checked it with his level, and reached for another. "This'll be standing when those frame cabins are kindling. This'll collapse before you finish the roof," Hodge shot back. "You can't build a load-bearing circle. The stones will shift. The curve won't hold. You need corners for structural integrity. That's basic carpentry. This is basic masonry," Emmett said quietly. "And a circle is the strongest shape there is. Ask the Romans. Ask anyone who's ever built an arch." Hodge's face darkened. The Romans didn't live in Montana. But the real objection wasn't structural. It was thermal. Emmett had explained his plan to a few neighbors, and word had spread. He wasn't just building a round cabin. He was building a heat battery. The stone walls would absorb warmth from the central fire throughout the day, storing it in thousands of pounds of thermal mass. At night, when the fire burned low, that stored heat would radiate inward, keeping the interior warm for hours after the flames died. In a rectangular cabin, the logs offered almost no thermal mass. They insulated, yes, but they didn't store heat. The fire warmed the air leaked out through the chinking, and by morning everything was cold again. You were heating space, not mass. Emmett's design flipped that equation. The central fireplace would sit in a stone hearth, surrounded by the circular wall. Heat would radiate outward in all directions, absorbed by stone on every side. Convection would pull warm air up toward the conical roof, where it would circulate back down along the curved wall, creating a continuous loop. No dead corners, no cold spots, just even, sustained warmth. He'd calculated the mass, roughly 4,000 pounds of stone in the walls alone, plus another 800 in the hearth and chimney base. Sandstone has a specific heat capacity of about 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. If he could raise the wall temperature by just 20 degrees during the day, he'd store 16,000 BTUs, enough to release steady heat for 6 to 8 hours overnight. In theory. The experts weren't interested in theory. "You're going to suffocate in there," said a trapper named Dalton, a man who'd wintered in the valley for 15 years. "Round walls, stone walls, there's no ventilation. Smoke will pool at the top and drop back down. You'll wake up dead." "I'm venting through the peak," Emmett explained. "Conical roof, open chimney, natural draft. Warm air rises, pulls fresh air in through the door gap. It's not complicated." "It's suicide," Dalton muttered. Others had different complaints. "Looks like a grain silo," someone said. "Where do you hang tools? Where do you put shelves? You can't square anything to a round wall. What happens when a mortar freezes and cracks? Stone's cold. You're building a root cellar, not a house." That last one made Emmett pause his work. He turned, stone in hand, and faced the small crowd that had gathered. "Stone's cold if you leave it cold," he said. "Heat it, and it stays warm. Longer than wood, longer than air, long enough to matter." "That's not how cabins work," Hodge said flatly. "Maybe that's the problem," Emmett replied. By mid-November, the walls were finished. The conical roof went on in sections, rough-cut pine beams radiating from a central hub like the spokes of a wheel, covered with overlapping cedar shakes that would shed water and snow. A small smoke hole at the peak, directly above the fire, with a pivoting cap to control draft. It didn't look like any cabin in Bitterroot Valley. It looked like a stone beehive, squat and heavy, built for endurance rather than elegance. Emmett's wife, Sarah, stood in the doorway the day they moved in, her arms full of blankets, her expression unreadable. "It's warm in here," she said, surprised, even without the fire going. "Residual heat from the mortar curing," Emmett said. "Give it a week. You'll see." But the valley didn't want to wait a week. They wanted to see it fail. The mockery started before the first snow. Emmett had barely finished moving his family into the round cabin when Martin Hodge made his opinion public at the valley's general store, a place where news spread faster than wildfire. "I give it a month," Hodge announced to a room full of settlers picking up supplies for winter. "First hard freeze, that mortal crack like pottery. Stone doesn't flex. Logs do." He's built himself a cold tomb. The men around the stove nodded. A few chuckled. "Even if it holds," Hodge continued, "he'll burn twice the wood trying to heat all that stone. You can't warm up mass like that efficiently. It'll suck heat right out of the fire and give nothing back. I've seen it before. Fancy ideas that sound smart until winter proves them stupid." Someone asked if Hodge had actually been inside the cabin. "Don't need to," Hodge said. "I know stone. I know fire. And I know you don't build round in a place where squares kept people alive for 20 years. The criticism wasn't just technical. It was personal. A trader named Fenton called it a Quaker silo and suggested Emmett was too scared of real Montana winters to build like a real man, hiding behind 2 feet of rock because he doesn't trust himself to keep a fire going all night. At the Sunday gathering, a farmer's wife looked at Sarah Carver and asked, loud enough for others to hear, "How do you hang a picture in there? How do you organize anything when the walls just curve away?" Sarah had smiled tightly. "We'll manage. I couldn't live in a place like that," the woman continued. "Feels like a cave. Feels like something animals would den in, not people." The children heard it too. Emmett's son, barely 10, came home one afternoon with a split lip and wouldn't say why until his mother pressed him. "They said we live in a bread oven," the boy muttered. "They said when winter comes, we'll freeze and Dad'll have to burn the furniture." Emmett had knelt down, eye to eye with his son. "Let them say what they want. We'll show them what works." But even he felt the weight of it. Not just the doubt he could handle. He'd built things before that people didn't understand at first. But this was different. This was communal judgment, the kind that turned a man and his family into outsiders. The kind that made neighbors stop offering help when you needed it most. A week before Thanksgiving, Emmett ran into Hodge outside the lumber mill. The older man was loading planks onto a wagon, prepping for repairs he expected to make on cabins throughout the winter. "Still standing, I see," Hodge said, nodding toward the direction of Emmett's property. "It is. For now." Hodge wiped sawdust from his hands. "Look, Carver, I'm not trying to humiliate you. I'm trying to save you the embarrassment of admitting you were wrong after your family suffers for it. It's not too late to frame up a proper cabin inside that stone shell. Use the round wall as a windbreak. Build a real cabin interior. You'd still have something functional." Emmett met his gaze. "It is functional. It's experimental," Hodge corrected. "And experiments are fine when you're alone. But you've got a wife and kids in there. When this fails, and it will fail, you won't just be cold. You'll be the fool who chose pride over their safety." The words landed heavier than any stone Emmett had ever lifted. Because there was a sliver of doubt, wasn't there? A small, cold voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "What if they're right? What if you've miscalculated? What if the theory doesn't match the reality of 20 below cold and wind that cuts through anything?" He went home that night and checked the chimney draw. He checked the mortar joints. He checked the door seal and the roof overlap and the hearth placement. Everything was sound. But sound on paper and sound in a Montana winter were 2 different things. Sarah found him standing outside the cabin just after dark, staring at the curved stone wall. "You're worried," she said. "I'm careful." "No." She stepped beside him, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. "You're worried. I can tell." Emmett didn't answer right away. Finally, "If I'm wrong, I've risked all of you." "If you're right," Sarah said quietly, "you've saved us." The first snow came 2 days later. Just a dusting, barely enough to cover the ground. But it marked the beginning. Winter was here, and the real test was about to begin. If you're still with me, hit that like button right now, because what happens next is going to prove exactly why the so-called experts were dead wrong. And trust me, The numbers don't lie. December arrived with teeth. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit on the 5th, then 10 degrees on the 8th, then held just above zero for a week straight. The wind came hard out of the north, the kind that found every crack and crevice in a building and pried it wider. In the valley's rectangular cabins, families were already burning through their firewood stockpiles faster than expected. The logs contracted in the cold, opening gaps that hadn't existed in the fall. Chinking fell out. Wind whistled through. Men woke at 2 in the morning to restart fires that had burned down to nothing, because if you let a cabin go cold in weather like this, it took half a day's worth of fuel to bring it back. Emmett's round stone cabin sat in the middle of it all, smoke rising steady from the central chimney. Inside, the family had settled into a routine. Morning fire, built hot and fast with split pine. By mid-morning, the stone walls had absorbed enough heat that Emmett could let the flames die back to coals. The temperature inside held at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, even as the outside air dropped to single digits. Sarah noticed it first. "I'm not cold," she said on the third day of the cold snap. "I thought I would be, but I'm not." The children played on the floor without shivering. The water bucket didn't freeze overnight. The interior stayed warm enough that condensation formed on the inside of the door in the mornings, a sign that the stone was radiating steady heat even while everyone slept. Emmett ran his hand along the interior wall before bed each night. The stone was warm to the touch, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the ambient air. Thermal mass doing exactly what heat calculated it would do, storing energy during the day, releasing it slowly through the night. But the real test came on December 19th. A blizzard rolled in from the Canadian Rockies, the kind old-timers said came once every 10 years. The temperature plunged to 12 below zero. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 20 feet. Wind gusts hit 40 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontal, piling drifts 6 feet high against anything that blocked its path. It lasted 3 days. Martin Hodges' cabin, built square and sturdy with double-chinked logs, nearly broke him. He burned through a cord of wood in 2 days, trying to keep the interior above freezing. The corner stayed so cold that ice formed on the interior walls. His children slept in the center of the room, huddled together under every blanket the family owned. He wasn't alone. All across the valley, families were fighting the same battle. Fires roared day and night. Men went out in the storm to split more wood, came back with frostbitten fingers, and fed the flames again. Some cabins held, some didn't. A trapper found one family sheltering in their barn with the livestock because the cabin had become unlivable, wind coming through the walls so hard it blew out the fire. Emmett's cabin sat silent in the storm, not because the fire had gone out, because it didn't need to burn hot. On the morning of the second day, with the wind shrieking and the temperature at 14 below, Emmett conducted an experiment. He let the fire die down to a bed of coals, nothing more. Just residual heat from the night's burn. Then he waited. An hour passed. The interior temperature dropped from 64 degrees to 61. 2 hours. 60 degrees. 3 hours. 59 degrees. The stone walls were doing the work. 4,000 pounds of thermal mass, heated to an average temperature of 70 degrees over the previous days, now releasing that stored energy into the interior space. Radiant heat, steady and even, no flames required. By the 4th hour, Emmett added just 3 logs to the coals. Not a roaring fire, just enough to maintain the cycle. The temperature stabilized at 62 degrees and stayed there. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, his daughter sat at the small table, reading by candlelight, wearing a single sweater. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, the valley emerged to assess the damage. Fences down, roofs caved in under snow load, livestock frozen in the fields, and firewood stockpiles decimated. Some families had burned a quarter of their winter supply in 72 hours. Martin Hodge walked past Emmett's cabin on his way to the general store, his face drawn with exhaustion. He stopped, stared at the round stone structure. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. No frantic shopping sounds. No desperation. Just warmth. Hodge didn't say anything. He just kept walking. But that afternoon, another neighbor stopped by. A quiet man named Collier, who ran a small ranch on the east side of the valley. "Can I ask you something?" Collier said. "Go ahead. How much wood did you burn?" "During the storm?" Emmett thought about it. "Maybe a third of a cord. Probably less." Collier's eyes widened. "I burned 2 cords. Full cords. And my cabin's still hit freezing inside." "Your walls are logs," Emmett said. "Logs insulate, but they don't store heat. When the fire dies, the warmth leaves. My walls do the opposite. They hold on to it." Collier touched the exterior stone. It was cold, as expected. The outside surface matched the ambient air. But he understood the implication. "The heat's on the inside," he said slowly. 24 inches deep," Emmett confirmed. "Takes a while to charge it up, but once it's warm, it stays warm." Collier nodded, processing. "Then, how warm is it in there?" "Right now?" 61, 62 degrees. "Jesus." Collier looked at his own cabin in the distance, smoke pouring from the chimney, his wife probably inside shoveling wood into the fireplace just to keep the place livable. "I'm at 45 on a good day." "Square corners," Emmett said. "They trap cold air. And your walls don't give anything back." Collier stood there for a long moment, his breath fogging in the cold. Finally, he met Emmett's eyes. "Hodge said you were building a tomb." "I know what Hodge said." He was wrong. Emmett didn't respond. He didn't need to. The storm had spoken louder than any argument ever could. And the numbers, the cold, hard, undeniable numbers, were about to make Martin Hodge and every other critic in Bitterroot Valley eat their words. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you next is the exact data that turned this fool's experiment into the most copied design in the territory. Word spread fast in a small valley, especially when survival was on the line. By the end of December, 3 more families had stopped by Emmett's cabin, not to mock, but to understand. They came with questions. How thick were the walls, exactly? How much stone? What kind of mortar held in temperatures this low? How did the fire draw with a centered chimney instead of an end wall placement? Emmett answered every question with the patience of a man who'd already proven his point. But it was Martin Hodge's visit in early January that changed everything. The builder showed up on a clear, bitter morning when the temperature sat at 8 degrees Fahrenheit. He didn't knock. He just stood outside the door until Emmett noticed him and waved him in. Inside, the cabin was warm. Not just tolerable, genuinely warm. Hodge stepped through the doorway and stopped, his face registering something between confusion and disbelief. "What's the temperature in here?" he asked. Emmett had hung a mercury thermometer on the interior wall, a recent addition after several neighbors asked the same question. 68 degrees, he said. Hodge stared at the thermometer like it was lying. "That's not possible. It's 8 degrees outside." 60-degree differential, Emmett agreed. "Stone walls are holding heat from yesterday's fire. I haven't added wood since sunrise." Hodge looked at the hearth. Coals glowed faintly, but there were no active flames. No roaring blaze. Just residual burn from the morning's kindling. "You're telling me," Hodge said slowly, "that you're maintaining 68 degrees on coals alone. For now, I'll add 3 logs around noon, let them burn down, and the walls will carry us through tonight." Hodge walked to the interior wall and placed his palm flat against the stone. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but noticeably warmer than his own hand. He moved along the curve, checking different points. Every section radiated the same gentle, consistent heat. "How much wood are you burning per day?" Hodge asked. "About 1/6 of a cord. Maybe less if the sun's out, and I get passive solar gain through the south-facing door." Hodge did the math in his head. 1/6 of a cord per day meant roughly 5 cords for a full winter. His own cabin was burning 12 to 14 cords per season, sometimes more if the weather turned especially brutal. "You're using half the wood I am," Hodge said quietly. "Closer to 1/3, actually, and you're warmer. 30 degrees warmer than your cabin, based on what you told Collier last week." Hodge had no response to that. He stood in the center of the round space, turning slowly, taking in the curved walls, the conical roof, the central hearth design that put the fire equidistant from every point on the perimeter. "I was wrong," Hodge finally said. Emmett looked up from the boot he was oiling. "About what?" "All of it." Hodge's voice was flat, factual, the tone of a man forced to confront evidence he couldn't dismiss. "I said it would collapse. It didn't. I said it would eat wood. It doesn't. I said you'd freeze. You're the warmest cabin in the valley. Appreciate you saying that. Don't. Hodge met his eyes. I didn't come here to apologize. I came here to understand how the hell this works, because if I'm going to keep building cabins in this territory, I need to know why yours is better. So Emmett explained. The thermal mass principle was simple. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. In a traditional log cabin, the fire heats the air, and the air escapes through gaps or loses energy to the cold exterior walls. You're fighting a constant battle against heat loss. But in a stone structure with sufficient mass, you're not heating air, you're charging a battery. During the day, the fire burns and radiates heat in all directions. The stone walls absorb that energy. A cubic foot of sandstone weighs roughly 150 pounds and has a specific heat capacity of 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Emmett's walls contained approximately 27 cubic feet of stone, or roughly 4,000 pounds. If he raised the average wall temperature by 20 degrees over the course of a day, he stored 16,000 BTUs in the walls alone. For comparison, burning 1 pound of seasoned firewood releases about 8,000 BTUs. That meant his walls, once charged, held the equivalent energy of 2 pounds of firewood, and they released it gradually over 12 to 16 hours instead of burning it away in 2. The round shape amplified the effect. In a square cabin, heat radiates toward flat walls and corners. Corners are dead zones. Air circulation breaks down, cold settles, and the fire has to work harder to compensate. In a circle, heat radiates evenly in all directions. Convection flows continuously along the curved surface, pulling warm air up toward the roof peak and cycling it back down along the walls. No turbulence, no cold pockets, just smooth, efficient thermal distribution. The geometry matters as much as the mass, Emmett said. You can't separate them. Hodge absorbed this in silence. Finally, what about ventilation? Dalton swore you'd suffocate. Chimney draft pulls fresh air in through the door gap. Warm air rises through the center, exits through the peak. I get a complete air exchange every 40 minutes without losing significant heat. The stone mass buffers the temperature, so the incoming cold air warms up fast. And the mortar? Everyone said it'd crack. Lime mortar with sand aggregate. Flexes slightly as the stone expands and contracts. I repoint any cracks in the spring, but so far it's been minimal. Hodge nodded slowly, processing. Then he asked the question Emmett had been waiting for. How much warmer is this than my cabin? Exactly, right now. Emmett glanced at the thermometer again. You said you're running 40 degrees inside when it's this cold out. I'm at 68. That's a 28-degree difference. During the storm, when you hit freezing inside, I stayed above 60. That's a 30-degree difference. 30 degrees, Hodge repeated, using half the wood. Using a third of the wood, Emmett corrected. And the stone will last 100 years. Your logs will rot in 30. Hodge stood there for a long moment, his pride visibly wrestling with the facts. Finally, he extended his hand. I need to see your foundation details, he said, and your roof attachment method. If I'm going to build one of these, I need to build it right. Emmett shook his hand. You're going to build one? I'm going to build 3, Hodge said. People are already asking. After that storm, half the valley wants to know how you stayed warm. They're not asking me anymore. They're asking you. And that was the moment everything shifted. Not because Emmett had won an argument, because the numbers had won it for him. 30 degrees warmer. Half the firewood. Stone walls that turn a cabin into a thermal fortress. You couldn't argue with that. And by spring, you couldn't ignore it either. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in the quiet, practical way that Rayol innovation spreads in small communities. One conversation at a time, one winter at a time, one family deciding they'd rather be warm than traditional. By March 1880, Martin Hodge had laid the foundation for his first round stone cabin. Not for himself, for a young family who'd nearly lost a child to pneumonia during the January cold snap. They'd come to Hodge with a simple request: build us what Carver built. We can't go through another winter like that. Hodge came to Emmett for guidance, and Emmett gave it freely. Foundation depth, wall thickness, Mortar ratio, chimney placement, the details that separated a functional design from a dangerous one. Don't rush the stone selection, Emmett told him. Dense rock holds heat. Porous rock doesn't. You want river stone, granite, sandstone, nothing with visible cracks or fracture lines. Hodge took notes like a man who'd learned the cost of assumptions. By June, 2 more builders in the valley had started round stone foundations. One was for a widow who'd burned through her entire firewood supply by February and had to rely on neighbors' charity to survive the rest of the winter. The other was for a young couple who'd just arrived from Ohio and heard the stories before they even built their first shelter. "We came west to start fresh," the husband told Emmett. "Seems stupid to start with a design that's already failing people." Emmett helped him lay out the circle. 12 feet, same as his own. "Start small," he advised. "You can always build another one nearby if your family grows. 2 small round cabins heat easier than 1 big square one." The wife asked about interior layout, the same question Sarah had faced a year earlier. "How do you organize things when nothing's square?" Sarah showed her. Curved shelves that followed the wall. A central table that left walking space all around. Beds against the perimeter where the stone radiated the most heat. "You adapt," Sarah said simply. "And then you wonder why you ever needed corners in the first place." By winter 1880, there were 5 round stone cabins in Bitterroot Valley. By winter 1881, there were 12. The designs varied. Some builders made them larger, 14 or 16 feet across. Some added interior stone partitions to create separate spaces. One family built 2 connected circles, sharing a central wall and chimney, creating a figure-8 layout that gave them 2 thermal zones. But the core principle remained the same: circular geometry, stone mass, central heat. And every single one of them outperformed the traditional rectangular log cabins in the same valley. The data was undeniable. Families in round stone cabins burn an average of 5 to 6 cords of wood per winter. Families in log cabins burned 12 to 15. The stone cabins maintained interior temperatures 25 to 30 degrees warmer than their log counterparts in equivalent weather. They required less maintenance. No chinking to replace, no logs to treat for rot, no corner joints to seal against wind. By 1883, even the skeptics had stopped arguing. Not because Emmett had convinced them with words, because their neighbors had convinced them with warmth. The phrase that circulated through the valley that year, repeated at the general store and the Sunday gatherings, was simple. He wasn't being stubborn. He was being practical, and that shift in language marked something deeper than acceptance. It marked understanding. Emmett Carver hadn't built a round stone cabin to prove a point or to rebel against tradition. He'd built it because the old way was failing his family, and he had the knowledge and the courage to try something better. The experts had called it dangerous. The community had called it foolish. The builders had called it a waste of time and resources. But when winter came, real winter, the kind that tested every structure and every decision, the round stone cabin had done exactly what Emmett said it would do. It had kept his family warm. It had conserved resources. It had stood firm against wind and cold and doubt. And in doing so, it had quietly rewritten the rules of frontier architecture in Bitterroot Valley. Martin Hodge built 17 round stone cabins before he retired. Every one of them outlasted the rectangular log cabins built in the same era. Some are still standing today, converted into storage sheds or historical markers, their stone walls as solid as the day they were laid. Emmett Carver never marketed his design. He never wrote a manual or claimed credit. He simply built what worked, shared the knowledge freely, and let the results speak for themselves. The lesson isn't just about stone and fire and geometry. It's about questioning assumptions, about recognizing that the way we've always done it isn't the same as the best way to do it, about understanding that innovation doesn't always look like progress at first. Sometimes it looks like a stubborn man building a circle when everyone else builds squares. But when the test comes, when winter drops to 20 below and the wind cuts through everything that isn't solid, the difference between theory and practice becomes obvious. 30 degrees warmer. Half the firewood. A family that stayed safe while others struggled. That's not stubbornness. That's engineering. And it's a lesson that still applies today, whether you're building a cabin in Montana or just trying to heat your home more efficiently. The principles don't change: thermal mass, geometry, and a willingness to challenge the conventional wisdom when it stops serving you. So here's my question for you. Which part of Emmett's design would you apply to your own home today? The thermal mass? The circular airflow? The central heat source? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know if you're dealing with brutal winters like Bitterroot Valley or if you're learning this for future use. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because every week I bring you one more piece of frontier wisdom that actually worked when survival depended on it. No myths, no guesswork, just proven techniques from people who built to last. Thanks for watching. Stay warm out there. Educational note: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.